The Sine Institute of Policy and Politics is American University's incubator for policy innovation. We convene leaders in the academic, public, private, nonprofit, and journalism sectors to engage and promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. In an evolving world, we seize the opportunity to work on the nation's most pressing challenges through collaboration by experts and top scholars in their field with students in research and scholarship. As part of that goal, the Sine Institute leverages American University's location in our nation's capital, the nexus of government and a growing international business center. We connect diverse perspectives from around the country and around the world with our world-class academics and research, experienced practitioners, and the most politically active student body in the U.S. We stand apart through our focus on the role of business and the nonprofit community in public policy, the rise of the importance of economic regions in the United States, and international policy issues. Our focus is to make an immediate impact at the intersection of policy and politics that leads to real and lasting change. Thank you for joining us as we convene, communicate, and collaborate. Introducing Sine Institute Fellow 2022, Julián Castro.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us as we kick off this seminar series that we're calling Time to Do Things Differently, Getting Beyond Policy Silos to Boost Economic Mobility. Let me just begin by saying how proud I am to be a 2022 Sine Institute Fellow at American University, and I want to give quick thanks and shout out to Amy Dacey, the director of the program, as well as Lanesa Clark, who's been wonderful, and Charles Leggett in helping to set up this seminar, and our student associates, particularly two whom you're going to meet in just a little while, Ruby and Ben. With that, just a word about this series. The last couple of years have been unlike any other that we've ever experienced in our lives. They've brought a lot of change. They've brought tremendous anxiety in different ways. They have also been toughest on the most vulnerable people in our country. Part of the focus of today's conversation is how federal policymaking can do things differently and do things better at this time when we're seeing historic outlays of federal resources to address issues like child poverty and homelessness and improving educational opportunity in our country, and doing away with student loan debt, any number of issues that go to the heart of creating opportunity for even the most vulnerable people in our nation. And I'm excited because today's session is called Inclusive Policymaking, Representing the Most Vulnerable. And I'm happy that we have a very special guest who has, I know, a lot to say about that, and most importantly, is living that right now as a new member of Congress. Our special guest, Mondaire Jones, represents New York's 17th Congressional District. He has an inspirational story that we'll talk a little bit about, raised by a single mother there in New York, attended Stanford and Harvard Law School, did a federal clerkship, worked as an attorney, and then in 2020, ran for the 17th Congressional District, succeeded Nita Lowey, who had served 32 years. At age 34, he's among the youngest congressional members in the entire 435 member body. We'll talk a little bit about that. And he also is groundbreaking. He and his fellow New York colleague, Richie Torres, became the first openly gay Black men to serve in the United States Congress. These days, he's working on a whole host of issues that touch on the lives of the most vulnerable, the lowest income Americans in our country. He's also put forth some impressive legislation that we're going to talk about. He's a progressive voice and in the middle of the fight, and I'm glad to welcome Representative Jones. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Secretary Castro, and what a joy it is to be back in college for the first time in a long time.
You're not that far removed from it, right? You're one of the few that is not that far removed from it.
You know, the best 4 years of my life, the best period of my life prior to serving in Congress were my years in college. And, you and I went to the same undergraduate institution. We didn't overlap, but I know we share an affection for that. And I've heard such great things about American and just really excited to be here.
I know all of the folks that are watching are excited to hear from you. I know particularly our students who, many of whom follow politics and follow policy, and also, of course, have a concern for making sure that our country works for everyone. And so I just wanted to get started, Representative Jones, with, you're, I wouldn't say completely unique, but very close to it in terms of a member of Congress. Not that many people get elected at the age of 32. Not that many people from, a background like yours. You have a very inspirational story. Just talk to us a little bit about how and why you were inspired to go into public service in the first place.
I talk often about how, for me, policy is personal. And what I mean by that is I grew up in Section 8 housing and on food stamps. And I was raised by a young single mom who had to work multiple jobs just to make ends meet. And she got help raise me from my grandparents. My grandmother cleaned homes, and when daycare was too expensive, she took me to work with her. And now I get to represent the same people whose homes I watched my grandmother clean growing up. As both an openly gay and an African-American person in this country, for me, the assault on fundamental rights, whether it is the right to vote or the right to live authentically, those issues are so personal for me. And what I eventually realized is that the struggles that people like my working class family and those in my community were experiencing were the result of policy choices. And I wanted to make more conscientious, empathetic policy choices, right? When I saw my mom work multiple jobs, I knew that our economy was broken. When I watched my grandmother work past the age of retirement just to pay for the high cost of prescription drugs and medical procedures not fully covered by Medicare, I knew that our healthcare system was broken. And so eventually I said, I've got to run for Congress to make better policy choices. And thankfully, against all odds, people rallied around me in my district, despite the fact that I had never held elected office and that I don't come from money or from a political family, which is also increasingly rare in this institution called Congress. Things worked out. And I think it's a lesson to anyone listening to this or watching this, that they too can dare to dream of making a difference.
And I mean, and what was it within you that had the confidence that you could actually succeed? Because when you started, Congresswoman Nita Lowey was there. She had served since 1989. She had not announced her retirement. Ultimately, she did retire. But I mean, so that was, quite a move in politics. But what gave you the confidence to put your name forward in that race?
As you well know, representation is so powerful. I looked to what had been happening in the years preceding my decision to begin that improbable journey to Congress, and saw other young people, including a number of young people of color, step out on faith and galvanize entire communities to place their faith in them. And I did it respectfully, of course. I mean, I just, in the example you just gave, this is someone who I myself looked up to, but who yearned to provide a different form, a bolder, frankly, form of leadership that I felt was necessary, especially during these times. You'll recall that Donald Trump was still president of the United States in July of 2019, when I announced that campaign, that my first congressional campaign. And so, it just is, and of course, growing up, I didn't have any representation. Certainly no one openly gay and Black. And so for that reason, didn't think that someone like me could run for Congress, let alone get elected. But it was seeing in the years preceding, not just those young people run for Congress, but also people like Pete Buttigieg announce a presidential campaign. And then at some point we overlapped in our respective campaigns. And guess what? It was normal to see an openly gay person running for federal office in my community, and of course, to say nothing of the inspiration that I got from watching him make history in that regard.
Yeah. And I mean, you stepped forward. You had a crowded primary. This was not a gimme, right? You had a crowded primary to win that race. And I think that it reflected, as you say, a lot of the positive change that has happened in our society over the years. You also represent a diverse district, right? Could you talk to us a little bit, because I want to get into, how we make sure that we're serving, a whole range of people in our country and the policies that do that. But please talk to us about your district. I imagine that, you have people of all different walks of life.
I do. It's, of course, it is the greatest congressional district in the nation. It is New York's 17th, and I describe it as, in many instances, a tale of two cities. Right? So for those of you who don't know, I represent the suburbs of New York City. And in fact, during redistricting, which happens every 10 years after the census, I'm going to go even farther north into the Catskills, and I'm picking up 2 additional counties. But for the time being, I represent Westchester and Rockland counties. It is at once an affluent district, the 19th most affluent congressional district in the country. But it is also a place where there are pockets of deep poverty, like where I grew up in the village of Spring Valley. We've got a very large immigrant community, specifically a large Hispanic community. And we are no stranger to, at least under the prior administration, and unfortunately a little bit under this current administration, ICE raids. And these are our friends and our neighbors and our loved ones. It is a district where we know the devastating impacts of climate change. I'm still personally devastated by the fact that 4 of my constituents passed in flooding from Hurricane Ida last fall. And so we've got our share of challenges. It's a majority white district, but also a district where there's a significant Black and AAPI population. So we really are a melting pot, and I'm so proud to represent it. And then I'm going to be picking up some rural parts in Orange and in Sullivan counties during this redistricting process. So you got, in my situation, you got to be responsive to a bunch of different constituencies. That's why it's so important to put a great team together who can specialize in different areas.
Well, I think it's an important point, because we hear so much these days about gerrymandering, and I have a front row seat to it down here in Texas. And look, I think Democrats haven't used it as maliciously toward racial minorities, for instance, but there is gerrymandering that happens in Democratic-controlled state legislatures, right? But my point is, even with that, you have districts that are not monolithic, and your district is an example of one that runs over a lot of land and different counties, and includes, as you say, people that are doing very well, that are affluent, but also folks like you and your family that are struggling, that you struggle, folks that are struggling now. And I wanted to focus on how you see, as a newcomer to Congress, federal policy addressing that. We're in this time of COVID where it has laid bare the tremendous inequality in our society. in many ways, folks that were not well off already, that were already struggling, are struggling even more. The number of people that are facing eviction, that are behind on rent, that may have lost their job or left their job for different reasons, just all around. And at the same time, during this term, you have been a part of major investments to try and fix some of these things. The infrastructure plan, the American Rescue Plan, you've been a champion of a robust Build Back Better investment. Just, I mean, as a top line, like your first impressions as a new congressman, how does the institution, just as an institution, how does it serve or misserve people that don't have the money for lobbyists, people that are low income, people whose voice isn't often heard?
I'm so invested in this question. And it gets at the heart of what a representative democracy, what representative government is, right? We watched, first of all, to your point, I'm so proud of what House Democrats have done under the leadership of the president this past year. The American Rescue Plan, let's take, for example. Through the expanded and fully refundable child tax credit, we literally cut child poverty in half. Yep. And now research is showing that that has had a positive impact on the brain development of children in lower income communities across America. It turns out when you provide people the basic necessities, food, housing, childcare, healthcare, that they benefit in myriad ways, including in their own growth and development. I think of what small businesses received under our expansion of what's called the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP. These forgivable loans that when I speak to folks across the ideological spectrum, they're just like, it was this investment that allowed us to keep the lights on, to keep our businesses from closing, and to keep our employees employed, which of course then allowed those employees to provide for their families. And now we've got the single largest investment in our nation's infrastructure in American history, which we just passed last fall, the bipartisan infrastructure law. And so which is going to, among other things, take lead out of water in communities like Flint and Newark and elsewhere. So we see the power of government to work for the people, as we say, as House Democrats. That's our motto, for the people. But we've also seen at the same time how broken systems, our broken democracy, to be more precise, has really thwarted the ability of people of good conscience like myself to really deliver more for working families, low-income families. We saw obstruction, we saw opposition to things that are broadly popular. I mean, Medicare negotiating the price of prescription drugs is supported by 90% of the American people. But because of the grip that lobbyists and big money have in our politics, you had about a dozen folks on the Democratic side, because we didn't get any support at all from our Republican colleagues, oppose that provision of Build Back Better.
Well, and Representative, if I can just ask you, and I think people be interested, just like mechanically, is it that there's a bubble that they're like over listening to these lobbyists more than their constituents, or how did, like, when you get in there, there's clearly, it's an esteemed institution, there is a separation that happens. How do you think that works, that people get kind of that out of touch?
Yeah, I know how it works. So when the first thing that happens when you say you want to run for Congress to somebody who is in politics is they say, how much money can you raise? And if the answer is not enough, then you're discouraged from doing it. And of course, the people who donate the big bucks in our politics are people who tend to be moderate to conservative. And so if you're constantly listening to those people, even if you have the best of intentions, as I believe all of my colleagues do, you start to only hear from one perspective. And eventually you start to think like the people who you are only speaking to. And of course you have limited time. And so when you're absent a campaign finance system of matching dollars, like what we have in New York City, for example, and what I have championed as part of the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act, which unfortunately was just filibustered in the Senate a few weeks ago. You've got a situation where the vast majority of folks are focusing their time and attention when they're not legislating and when they're not sort of doing events in their district on having conversations with people who have the financial resources to support their reelection. It is why we must get big money out of our politics. We've got this small dollar matching program that would amplify working class folks, grassroots donors. It's a 6-to-1 matching program. If you donate $50, it becomes $350.
You're talking about in New York?
Well, actually in New York City, I think it's 8-to-1. Under HR 1, which was called the For the People Act, which then became the Freedom to Vote Act.
Yeah.
And which we passed in the House, by the way, it would have been a 6-to-1 at the federal level. And I think that's how you get more working class folks in Congress. And that's how you diminish the influence of these corporate lobbyists who are not thinking about the average American. They're thinking about their bottom line for their corporation. With the pharmaceutical industry has tremendous resources and lobbied aggressively to prevent a majority in the House of Representatives from supporting the ability of Medicare to negotiate prescription drug prices.
Mm-hmm. And when we talk about inclusive policymaking, it has at least kind of two sides to it. When we're talking about making policy that benefits everyone, not just folks that are already well off or folks that are represented by these lobbyists. There's the other side also, which you talked a little bit about, which is policymaking is better, I'm sure, when it is inclusive, when it's being made. You have a range of people demographically that are there at the table. Let me just ask you, as a groundbreaking congressman, somebody who represents, along with Richie Torres, a historic first, what do you make of Congress as either inclusive or not very inclusive? And what are the barriers to that type of inclusive policymaking?
I am one of only 9 openly LGBTQIA members in the House. And in the Senate, there are only 2. That's of, when you add the Senate and the House together, 535 people, 11 of us. And of course, there are not nearly as many women in Congress as exist in the larger American population. We still have so many strides yet to be made when it comes to that. And that plays out. That plays out. There are instances is where on the Republican side in the Senate, it's like it's the women who are only the women on that side who are standing up for dignity in the workplace for women, for example, when we talk about our federal laws. And so you see that representation kind of play out in example after example, that lived experience really informing people's advocacy. And so I think, and frankly, I was, because I've been so focused on the Supreme Court recently, I've been thinking of something that Sandra Day O'Connor wrote about how she learned from Thurgood Marshall, from his experiences as a Black man growing up during Jim Crow, but also litigating civil rights cases in the Deep South, and how that informed her perspective as someone who was a jurist and, let's face it, was kind of making law. Because the Supreme Court interprets and even makes new law sometimes. I know that that's a controversial statement, but it's just a fact. And so when, from my vantage point as a member of Congress, I'm grateful for the fact that I have the opportunity to raise issues of how will this policy impact the LGBTQ community or the queer community of color, or the Black community for that matter.
And have you had those moments that you felt that in meetings and,
Absolutely.
can you relate one of those, or is there something specific that comes to mind, or is it just more generally you're aware of that, in these meetings?
Yeah. So in addition to the work that I do in my office, like trying to, I just led a letter with Richie Torres, for example. I think it's in the press today, calling on the CDC and also CMS, so Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services, to require that this new injectable form of PrEP, which is a life-saving medication that if you take it will prevent you from being infected with HIV, to require that all insurance companies cover it in the way that they do the oral form of PrEP, which is called Truvada, Descovy, whatever. Knowing that HIV has ravaged the Black and Hispanic communities. And that's something that's personal for me. I don't think anyone else would have written that letter. And even as my colleagues work on these issues in other contexts, there was something early on last year. There was a non-discrimination provision in a piece of legislation that we were considering as an education and labor committee. And I noticed that it didn't include in one provision members of the LGBTQ community. And so I raised that issue. And my colleagues backed me up on that, and we got it in there, and it passed out of committee. But this stuff happens all the time. Yeah. And that's why representation is so important. And it's not malicious. It's not that people don't care. I mean, we are talking about people who vote for this thing ultimately. It's just that sometimes it's not on your radar if you're not living through a specific experience.
Yeah, you've seen how that lived experience really makes a difference and informs your policymaking. And as much progress as there's been in terms of beefing up the ranks of members of Congress, state legislators, city council members, county supervisors that are people of color or from the LGBTQ community, women, just traditionally disadvantaged groups, there's still a long way to go, as you mentioned. I mean, you just went through your own race where you had the gumption to step forward, and you didn't know you were going to win when you stepped forward, right? You beat the odds, really. I mean, in so many ways. How do you think that we can improve that underrepresentation? Create more representation in terms of whether it's Congress or state legislatures or city council bodies?
I think that we must take very seriously the project of democracy reforms, right? So the reason that we don't have a truly representative government today, whether it is federally or at the state level, in so many states across this country, or at the level of municipalities, is because if you are a low-income person or working class person, or even middle-class person, frankly, or if you are a person of color, or if you are a woman, or if you are a member of the LGBTQ community, or you are a person with disabilities, it is more difficult for you to raise the money required to win elected office. It is also the case that people who are in the establishment, especially in some parts of this country, are less likely to view you as a viable candidate, in part because they've not seen someone like you in office before.
So easier to dismiss you or think, well, you're not going to win.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so we've got it, and so that's why the small dollar matching program, I think, is important, or any kind of public finance program. I mean, there are different ways to do it. I think another proposal is democracy dollars, right? Where everyone everyone in a society, in the electorate, gets X number of dollars that they can then use to contribute to candidates of their choice. That is even more inclusive and democratic than a small dollar matching system like what I described. And I think Larry Lessig has really talked about, he's really pioneered this question of democracy dollars.
Yeah.
And then, of course, partisan gerrymandering is something that you alluded to earlier. This is a system where in many states, elected officials are choosing their voters rather than voters choosing their elected officials, right? It is a distortion of our democracy that QAnon conspiracy theorists are coasting to victory in general election contests, despite their views not being mainstream, right? But it's because they've prevailed in their primaries and are virtually, because of the way the district has been drawn, guaranteed to win so long as they have an R next to their name on the general election ballot. And of course, we need to have tougher, more robust disclosure rules around the people who are playing in elections, right? Like if people who are pumping millions of dollars or even hundreds of thousands of dollars into elections should be required to disclose that. The sunlight is the best disinfectant. The American people deserve to know who is backing certain candidates, because policies are directly impacted, or lack thereof, are directly impacted by the people who are making those policies. And I think we need better people in elected office across the board.
Yeah, and I mean, you have wasted no time in making your voice heard on a number of issues, and I want to focus on a couple of them. Along with Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, you are supporting something called the End Child Poverty Act that aims at doing what the title says. Talk to me a little bit about your focus on trying to end child poverty in our country.
Yeah, this is a more expansive version of the child tax credit that we so proudly passed last year under the American Rescue Plan. We can cut poverty permanently, child poverty permanently in this country. And it turns out one way to do it is to give every family in America a check that they can then use to afford the basic necessities of life. A lot of people say, well, there are certain federal programs that are already responsive to the question of poverty, to the issue of poverty. Well, as you know, the way we define poverty in this country has not changed since 1963. Yeah. There were so many expenses not associated. People may laugh, but like the cost of an annual cell phone, or internet, which is like required if you want to be in the 21st century economy. All of these things add up. Childcare, all these things were not considered at the time that we defined poverty as a federal government, to say nothing of the fact that there's no regional variation and that's accounted for in the way that the federal government defines poverty. And because of the success of last year's program, Rashida and I decided to introduce this legislation, and I'm really excited about it.
You also have been outspoken on the Supreme Court. And I bring this up for a number of reasons. I mean, obviously, the Supreme Court is always important, maybe, at no time more than right now, when voting rights and election subversion and this, what I see as a move toward anti-democratic authoritarianism has taken grip on one side of the aisle. You've called for expanding the Supreme Court, I think from 9 to 13. And now this is, you are a trained attorney. You're not coming at this just saying, oh, well, I think we should just expand it to expand it. I mean, talk to us about why you believe that and how you think that could better serve the average American citizen.
On Thursday, April 15th of last year, the chair of the Judiciary Committee, Jerry Nadler, and the chair of the subcommittee on the courts, Hank Johnson, and I, along with Ed Markey over in the Senate, introduced what's called the Judiciary Act of 2021. And it would add 4 seats to the Supreme Court. It would restore balance to an institution that is, at this point, governed by a majority of justices who are hostile to democracy itself. Much has been made of the voter suppression that we have seen in places like Georgia and Texas and in Arizona over the past year. But the fact is, those voter suppression laws were only able to be enacted because of a 2013 decision written by Justice Roberts called Shelby v. Holder, striking down the preclearance provision of the Voting Rights Act, which used to require that if you are a municipality or a state that had a history of racist voter suppression, you had to get approval before you enacted a law because you were not to be trusted.
Well, and Representative Jones, if you'll allow me, like, just so we can emphasize this for the folks listening, because sometimes, I feel like this used to require states like my home state of Texas, where I'm at now, or many of these southern states that had a very clear history of racist election laws meant to suppress the vote from people of color, especially Black Americans. They actually had to go and get clearance for everything from what their ballot was going to look like to other procedures for their elections under the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Shelby v. Holder in 2013 did away with that. And then we saw this proliferation of anything goes type procedures to suppress the vote after that.
And it was on this theory that as Chief Justice Roberts wrote in his decision, things have changed in the South. But of course, not enough has changed, because we see them doing the same thing that they were doing during the Civil Rights Movement. And the court has continued to not find a voter suppression law that it is, unconstitutional. I mean, and has continued as recently as a few days ago to chip away at the Voting Rights Act. Last year was Brnovich v. DNC on July 1st of 2021, which gutted the original meaning of Section 2, which really was all that remained of the Voting Rights Act. And now they just signaled, through a decision that they made, that they're going to uphold the racially gerrymandered map in Alabama, which prevents a second majority minority district from being drawn. I mean, this is a court that is hostile to the electoral power of racial minorities, on top of being one that is preparing to overrule explicitly, because it's already done so implicitly in Texas, Roe v. Wade this term. I mean, it is a court that does not respect the will of Congress, because obviously it was Congress that unanimously reauthorized the Voting Rights Act in 2006 over in the Senate and nearly unanimously in the House, and one that is bringing its sort of partisan hostilities to the bench in what is supposed to be a neutral setting where you just apply existing law to the facts. And so to restore balance, we must do what has happened 7 times before in our nation's history, which is change the size of the Supreme Court. And thankfully, since we introduced that bill in April of last year, a majority of Americans, 56% as of September, agree with the statement that we should add seats to the Supreme Court to protect reproductive rights.
Yeah, and I know that you have been a very clear and consistent voice on this, but what is your estimation of where it goes from here?
Unfortunately, the American people are further along in their thinking on Supreme Court expansion than most members of Congress today. But what I think is going to happen, and what has been the case over the past year, is that as this Supreme Court continues to issue radical decision after radical decision, stripping away or undermining fundamental rights, that more and more people in Congress are going to say, enough is enough. We've got to restore integrity and balance to this institution. I mean, when Justice Roberts, who authored that Shelby decision, which gutted the heart of the Voting Rights Act, is now in the minority in this Alabama case, he's not only lost control of his court, but it just speaks to how much worse things have gotten even since 2013.
Yeah, I mean, it's like real, Dr. Frankenstein dynamic going on there with Roberts and some of the folks that are now much further to his right on these issues. And just for the audience, we're going to take questions in about 5 minutes. And so if you have some questions, please feel free to throw them into the Q&A and we'll take them from there. But right before we get to those questions, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about something that I know both of us have an interest in, which is housing. You know, in your bio, you mentioned you grew up in subsidized housing. So you're not a stranger to the struggles of people who may find themselves needing public housing or some sort of subsidized housing. We have a lot of people during these last couple of years of the pandemic who have been evicted now that eviction moratoria have lapsed in most places. Talk to me about, you know, your view on getting us closer to folks seeing housing as a human right.
I couldn't help but think back to what happened last summer when my colleague from St. Louis, Missouri, Corey Bush, courageously camped outside the Capitol, on the Capitol steps in August, and how I and others joined her. And we didn't know.
I think I saw some of the pictures of y'all out there.
Yeah, we didn't, you know, I was in my Jordans, right? in my working families party t-shirt. You know, we didn't know that the administration was gonna do what we wanted it to do, but we knew that we had to try, and we weren't willing to go home on August recess while, you know, many millions of people were at risk of being evicted in the midst of this deadly pandemic. And and of course the administration did, you know, use this executive authority. And of course the Supreme Court eventually struck down that extension of the moratorium. I do believe that we saved lives. And it's a shame that there's homelessness at all in this country, because it turns out it's not that expensive to prevent it from happening, right? I mean, you could house every unhoused person in this country at a fraction of what we spend on any number of things, not least of which this bloated defense budget. I mean, you know, this is obviously personal for me. I know it is for you, given the work that you've done. But the fact is, if you don't have a roof over your head, you can't think about the quality of your educational experience. You don't have the luxury of dreaming of going off to a good school and becoming whatever it is that you want to be. You can't really afford to think about your next doctor's visit if you're trying to figure out where you're gonna, you know, lie your head down at night. And it is of such, for that reason, foundational importance that we solve this. I'm a beneficiary of subsidized housing, but the fact is the waiting list is absurdly long to get Section 8. And of course, we need to expand the number of eligible people by changing the criteria and recognizing that it is extremely expensive to live in this country, especially in some parts of this country, like where I'm from. And of course, we had $60 billion allocated in Build Back Better to rehabilitate public housing that already exists in places like NYCHA, which I think is the largest provider of housing, the New York City Housing Authority in the nation. And of course, to build additional units of housing from Westchester to Appalachia, you know. So this is something, and then of course there's the issue of segregated housing, right? If you want every kid in America to have a quality public education, you cannot prevent them from living in communities that have good quality public education.
Well, and I was going to ask you about that, Representative, because I mean, you represent Westchester County. For folks that follow housing, that rings a real bell, right? Westchester County, for many, many years, was one of these counties. Show Me a Hero, the HBO series from a few years ago, focused on a place in Westchester. Rob Astorino, that used to be out there, I think, as the county executive, was sort of, in my eyes, the poster child for trying to keep out affordable, especially public housing. How do you navigate that as somebody who represents many of those folks in Congress, but has a different personal experience and ideology than that?
I am so grateful for the enlightened thinking that has occurred even over the past several years in Westchester and elsewhere. Rob Astorino is still around. I think now he's running a hate-filled,
like his 7th race or something in the last couple of years.
He's running a hate-filled campaign for governor of New York now on the Republican side, and he's got his work cut out for him. You'll be pleased to know that Rob is now a constituent of mine, and I am his member of Congress.
Well, I'm pleased that you're the congressman and not him, for sure.
That's right. That's right. That's right. I am optimistic, but I also know that change doesn't just happen. You've got to make it happen, which is why I've used my platform to talk about the importance of building housing that is affordable, not just in Yonkers and in Mount Vernon, which my colleague Jamal Bowman represents, Yonkers being the place where Show Me a Hero, that HBO show miniseries, was based, but also in Chappaqua, which I represent, and where the Clintons live, and elsewhere, and we had a Democratic slate that just ran on bringing more housing that is affordable to Chappaqua, and so we've got to make sure that we keep talking about these issues, that people understand that there's nothing to fear about it, and I believe that people are fundamentally good, and I know that based on the conversations that I've been having.
Wonderful. Well, now we're going to take a few questions from folks. I know we have a whole bunch in the Q&A, and I really was fortunate to have a whole group of student associates that helped put all of this together and promote it. And 2 of them, Ruby and Ben, are going to kick us off with a couple of questions. Not sure how they decided who was going to go first, but I'll turn it over to them and they'll start off our Q&A.
How's it going? I've got the first question for you, Representative Jones. So you talked about your queer identity and being a gay man in Congress. And as a queer woman of color, I'm very conscious of the ways that being authentic in expression of queer identity can close doors and limit opportunities for you, especially in politics where so much is based on how you're perceived and your visibility. Did you ever think about not being openly gay during your campaign or your career?
So absolutely. And Ruby, thank you for sharing your personal story, because I know that that's not something that is always easy either. But the more you say it, the more courage you have, time and again. I remember being so afraid of coming out on the campaign trail, and I was out at work, I was out to my friends, I was out to anyone who would ask me, but I wasn't going around declaring it in the church setting and in the larger community where I grew up. And so there were a lot of folks who were still surprised. I bet there are still some of my constituents that don't know I'm gay. And that's actually a good thing, because it means that it doesn't matter for purposes of whether they'll vote to elect me to Congress. But it's also the case that the representation piece does matter. And because I did not see a representative like myself, obviously there had never been an openly gay Black member of Congress until me and Richie Torres made history. Mm-hmm. I didn't think that or an openly gay local elected official in my community, and certainly not an openly gay person of color on top of that. So, by the way, I'm also the first person of color to ever represent my congressional district. So there was just a lot of stuff that I did not see growing up. And for that reason, did not imagine myself doing politics, as much as I wanted to help to improve the community that raised me, that gave me so much, that gave me a chance to live the American dream. So it was, I also looked at what people like Dr. King and Bayard Rustin in different contexts, obviously did. And I thought to myself, if Bayard Rustin could put himself out there, obviously he was the architect of the March on Washington, but was not able to be visible because he was gay, then the least I could do in at the time, 2019, was make the world that I wanted to live in. And by the grace of God, thank God, like it worked out. I had pastors supporting me in my campaign because they knew that my heart was genuine and that I wanted to improve our community. And I'm so grateful for those relationships.
That's amazing to hear about how you navigated that journey, and especially like the support of a religious community is so impactful.
Great.
Ben?
Yes, thank you, Secretary Castro. This has been really great, so thank you, Congressman, for coming to our university and sharing your thoughts on these super important issues. We know that we need federal policy to protect Americans no matter where they are, but also that trust in government and real effective policy solutions happen at the local level, where people have dinner with their leaders or see them in town every day, shopping at the grocery store or something. In trying to tackle inclusive policy, how do we work on improving and increasing agency of local leaders and balancing that with ensuring that all Americans at the federal level are protected and given the resources that they need?
Such a good question. And it's complicated, right? I mean, I think that it's incumbent upon people to know that they should get involved in the first place at the local level, and that they do have agency. I lean on not just my local elected officials in my congressional district, but the leaders and members of grassroots organizations devoted to any number of issues, for their expertise, their experience, to let me know sometimes what other members in this very large 435 person building, institution are working on. So there've been so many instances where a constituent of mine has said, "Hey, can you please sign on to this thing? This is why it's important." And I wasn't even aware that individual had introduced the legislation. So that's how I personally, empower, I would say, people locally. And I think all members of Congress should be doing the same thing. But, I would say, to anyone who's thinking about becoming involved locally, please join or form an organization. And you'll be pleasantly surprised, I think, by how many folks of like mind you can find. And, we also are passing legislation at the federal level that it requires input at the local level to implement, whether it's the infrastructure projects all across this country. We're working with stakeholders locally to apply for different grants. We've got over $1 trillion in infrastructure investment now. And we have an entire handbook that we are circulating to our local elected officials and organizations about things that they can apply for, and we try to bolster those applications.
Right. We have another, thank you, Ruby and Ben. We have a question that says, "I'm a Democrat and understand the issue of SCOTUS and Supreme Court. My question is, if it was a 6-3 liberal court, slide, would Dems still advocate for expanding the court, or would it not matter then because Dems control the court?"
The issue is we have a court that is hostile to democracy. This isn't about Republicans and Democrats. I mean, Justice John Paul Stevens and David Souter were Republican, lifelong Republicans, and they were nominated by Republican presidents of the United States. Sandra Day O'Connor, lifelong Republican, nominated by a Republican president to the Supreme Court. And those are not the justices that I'm talking about. Those are not the kinds of justices that are in the majority today gutting the Voting Rights Act. So I would say it's not about that. It's about having folks who are going to respect the will of Congress, and who are going to protect the fundamental right to vote in this country, which is the cornerstone of our democracy.
So I want to also ask, and you started in January of 2021, right? So basically you just hit your year mark recently. How do you think your relationship with your community has changed since holding office? How do you stay connected with the micro after working so much in the macro?
So I'm proud to have done 7 town halls last year, both in person, virtually, and telephonically. And I want to do even more this year because I didn't see that when I was growing up. And I want to make sure that I'm providing a different form of leadership. And I want people to understand that it's not just about FaceTime for the sake of FaceTime. It's also about the way that people feel about their government, right? So if you don't do town halls and you don't listen to your constituents, even if you're generally doing what they would have you do, a lot of folks are going to feel like government doesn't care about them. And that is in part what led to what happened on January 6th. This feeling that government was not for the people, was not of the people, in addition to some other lies that were pushed. So we've got to make sure that we're, I'm pretty good about this because I'm still close to not having held elected office, that I'm not taking any of this for granted. But I would say that I would encourage all of my colleagues to be thinking of how they can engage their communities. I'm also very active on Twitter, on Instagram. I read DMs. My constituents comment and retweet and quote tweet. And even if I'm not replying on that platform, my staff is reaching out to those folks there was someone who tagged me today saying that she had an issue. And my staff knows to reach out to that person pretty quickly.
Yeah. Someone asked, what advice would you give to young people entering progressive politics?
Be bold, be passionate, understand that your energy, your idealism is needed in this moment more than ever before, as folks try to take us back to a bygone era, as democracy itself is on the ballot, and be encouraged. I'm privileged to have authored key provisions of the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act, which passed the House but was filibustered in the Senate, the way voting rights legislation was filibustered during the Civil Rights Movement. But we came so close. 48 Democratic senators were in support of a rules change to this arcane, really irrelevant procedural relic called the filibuster. And all we needed, because we weren't going to get, unfortunately, any Republican support to secure the right to vote in this country, were 2 more Democratic senators to agree that we must save our democracy in this moment, which faces its greatest test since the Jim Crow era. And that was an extraordinary achievement. And so if you ask me, I'm using my energy to pick up some other folks of good conscience in the fall.
A question for you. What are your thoughts on what the United States government can do at the federal level to raise wages for American workers, and not just the lowest wage workers that work at the minimum wage, but all lower and middle income workers?
So we've got something called Davis-Bacon, which is a statute that says if there's a construction project valued at $2,000 or more that's funded by the federal government or financed by the federal government, that you've got to pay prevailing wages, not just minimum wage, but prevailing wages. to workers on those projects. We've also got to make sure that we take a holistic view of the cost of living, right? So if healthcare is free, or if childcare is affordable, if public education is high quality everywhere, if housing is a right, then your money goes further. And so I think of things not just in terms of income, which is also important, but in terms of what other programs, what other aspects of living can we make more affordable for people?
Somebody also asked, what are the most critical issues facing minority and low-income communities today that prevent upward mobility? Do you believe that there's a multifaceted solution to addressing these issues?
So the question was about what are the most pressing issues facing?
Yeah, the most pressing issues facing low-income and minority communities,
Yeah.
for upward mobility. And really, I think, and how do you connect those dots?
I think of our broken democracy. I think of the fact that the policies that are going to secure dignity and an economy that works for everybody, and a legal system, a criminal legal system, or an immigration system that works for everybody, is through having representative government, people who have the lived experiences of the folks they are trying to represent, or who are not beholden to corporations and billionaires who would steer them away from focusing on their constituents through policies that are broadly popular with the American people, it turns out.
One question that I have that I meant to ask you earlier was, as a new member of Congress, I think a lot of folks who campaign, especially in their first congressional race, talk about bringing people together. A lot of candidates do. I remember when my brother Joaquin, who represents the 20th congressional district, started in 2013, one of the things he noticed right away is that everybody's in their camp. Like from the beginning orientation that you have, new member orientation, there's Democrats and Republicans, and then you sit generally on different sides of the aisle, literally of the chamber. I mean, what is your impression of institutionally what can be done to encourage people working together, not just within the body, but outside of that? We talked a little bit about gerrymandering and other things, but, or is that a fanciful notion that's overplayed too much? What's your perspective on that?
I had this discussion at dinner with a colleague of mine who I think takes a more optimistic view than I do on what can happen in this moment to foster bipartisanship, absent legislative changes like an end to partisan gerrymandering, which causes people who are extreme and unrepresentative to get to Congress. Specifically folks who don't vote for voting rights legislation, or who won't admit that President Biden won the presidential election in November of 2020. Yeah. It's hard to expect, and you just look at the voting patterns, anyone who's in that situation to work with you in good faith on things. Having said that, we pass bipartisan legislation in Congress all the time. It doesn't make the news. It has happened as recently as this week. But yesterday, for example, we passed a bill that ends this practice in the House. We passed a bill that would end forced arbitration of claims of sexual harassment and other misconduct in the workplace. And and that was significant. Of course, we passed a package of postal office reforms. And so that's happening, but it is increasingly difficult in this environment where I would say right-wing cable TV is pushing really toxic ideologies like white replacement theory and saying that, people who are asking folks to wear masks and get vaccinated or have more sinister motivations, or who, as I mentioned, won't acknowledge that the president is the duly elected president of the United States. That is untenable. And I think the way to fix that is to make our elections more democratic, which I think will lead to a recalibration on TV as well of what some people are saying. I mean, Fox News was not always this bad. It was not always this extreme. It's responding to the kinds of folks who are being sent to Congress.
All right, final question. One of the key pieces of President Biden's tenure so far, push legislatively, has been Build Back Better. If you believe the reporting right now, Build Back Better is, quote, dead, at least in the form that it existed. There are a lot of folks that have a lot of heartburn about that, because that was a piece of legislation that would have invested transformationally, especially in the most vulnerable folks across this country, in low-income communities, communities of color, people that are struggling. As one of the more outspoken voices, a progressive voice, where do you see us going from here to make sure that we do right by those communities, even if that piece of legislation, as it was recognized, BBB, does not get passed?
Well, we have got to pass Build Back Better, and I'm not giving up on it. We've got $555 billion for climate alone, which obviously would be the single largest investment in climate action. I already mentioned we've got money for housing in it, and I'm proud to have played a leading role in getting universal childcare provisions in that legislation, and of course we passed all of it in the House. So I'm not giving up hope that we can get some version of Build Back Better passed over in the Senate. But in the meantime, the president has to be using his executive authority to improve people's lives. And that means canceling student debt. It means not continuing to use the resources of the federal government to subsidize fossil fuel projects. It means looking at what can be done within our criminal legal system to make it a fairer, more equitable system. And that is what this president should do immediately in order to, I think, restore faith that a lot of people have been lacking, unfortunately, in government these past few months.
Well, Representative Jones, thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure that everybody loved hearing from you, and please keep up the fight there in Washington.
Thank you.
And join us again, hopefully at some point in the future. And we look forward to many more successes on your end to come. All right. And to everybody, thank you all for joining us. I hope that you'll catch our next session on March 2nd, and stay tuned for more information about that.